So we're going to look at um, social changes during the Age of Exploration. And by that, I mean that instead of looking at great man history, that is, the big names, the Columbuses, the Da Gamas, the Magellans that are sailing around the world, we're going to look at what's happening to the, quote, normal people who are living in Europe at this time and just try to get an understanding for what life is like for Europeans in this era and to see how things are changing for them. So one of the big ones, and this will lead into the second thing, is attitudes that are held towards women. So we kind of seen this sense of like it's kind of conflicting things. You have in some classes of society some progression for women. During the Renaissance, they're able to get more education and have opportunities that they previously hadn't had. But also because of some changing social status, there's this division of spheres. So there's the domestic sphere, which is intended to be the women's role, and then there's the working sphere, which is intended to be the men's. And so you have kind of, in the upper classes, women gaining a little bit in terms of social equity, but in the lower classes, not so much, and just kind of finding their roles a little more stagnant. And so what we find is that as a result of the Reformation, you have many of the Protestants arguing that women, yes, they could attain salvation, and therefore they are religiously equal and spiritually equal to men, with the same opportunities for faith and arriving to heaven. But that did not make them socially equal. And that's a real key distinction that they had made, is that women were not the social equals of men, although they were perhaps spiritual equals. And so that's a real distinction that the Protestant reformers make. And in their eyes, there's kind of three different purposes to marriage. First is procreation, is to have children, to grow your family, in order to spread the faith and populate the earth. That is kind of a continuation of the mission to go forth and make disciples by having many children that could go then later on be disciples. So there's kind of that going on. The second is to avoid temptation. There was a real view of women as kind of consistently falling and giving into lust. And so women were perceived as being inclined to kind of out of marriage affairs into premarital sex and these sorts of things. And so the idea was that if you could get women married, then they would be less inclined to do that. They could fulfill their urges within the confines of their marriage. Again, not really a positive way to look at things, but the way that a lot of people were looking at it at the time. So the last one, the other purpose, is just companionship. That idea of being able to spend your life with somebody and enjoy your time with somebody. So there you go. Those are the three main kind of purposes to marriage. And Protestants really truly believe that the woman's highest calling and their main calling was to marriage. And that's kind of a difference between them and Catholics, because Catholics also believe that marriage was important. But in Catholicism, there's also the opportunity to become a nun. And that was itself viewed as being truly important for the livelihood of the church. So you kind of got those two things going on. As I mentioned previously, the household becomes more of the domain of the woman, and that is their domestic sphere where they control things. Despite that, you end up with some single working class women who do work outside of the home. A lot of them are working as domestic servants and in roles like that. And then if women were married and their husbands had their own business, oftentimes women were brought in to help them out and to help run those businesses. So we've got that going on. So there are some opportunities. I don't want to paint it as if there's no opportunities for women, but they are certainly limited, and there's certainly a lot of stigma against them. And that shows up in what we call the Great European Witch Hunt. And that lasts from basically 1560 to 1660. And in that 100 years, you have about 100,000 women who are killed. So, like, that's a lot. That's really a lot of people killed for being witches. And so you have this kind of panic that hits the the world during the Reformation. And there's the kind of not one distinct reason for it, but there's kind of some overlapping reasons. One is this effort to prove how holy you were and how religious you were, and you would do so by accusing someone else of being not holy and not good. And so you would call them a witch, and you would go ahead and kill them. There's a real effort to crack down on heretics. You have the Holy Office. You have then also Lutherans and Calvinists fighting against Catholics. And so everyone's looking for heretics and people who are wrong. And then there's also this socioeconomic element that could play into it, where the economy kind of tanks for a little bit, and there's this fear about economic anxiety and inflation and food and those sorts of things. And when that happens, necessarily people want a scapegoat, right? When there's crop failure, so whose fault is it? It's obviously the witch's fault. Can't be anything else. So we kill the witch. And who are the witches? It's always women, because of this general misogyny that exists essentially since the beginning of recorded history and continues to this day, where women are treated as lesser and as inferior, and they don't play as meaningful a role in society. So blaming them is easier than blaming somebody else. So you blame the women for these problems. And generally, the people who are targeted are older women. Oftentimes they're widows or they're midwives. And they target the midwives because there's this real bizarre belief that these midwives are killing these babies. These midwives are witches and they're killing babies. Which, it defies all 21st century logic. But we have to put ourselves back in their element, where so many of their children would die in childbirth, and so many women would die in childbirth. So you can imagine that if you lost your child or your wife or your daughter, you would be angry and grieving, and you would want answers. And so you would oftentimes just find a scapegoat. Those scapegoats happen to be these midwives, and you would say they are a witch. They killed my husband or my wife, child, daughter, whatever it may be, and you would call them a witch, and they would find themselves killed. So that's kind of what's going on. Is this misogynistic, this anti-woman feeling, targeting older women because they have no one who's speaking for them. They are also kind of tend to be outcasts, not social, or targeting midwives because so often women and children would die in childbirth, and so it's easy to find someone to blame. Same idea, crop failures. There must be a witch who's cursing our town. A disease hits, must be a witch. Let's look for the old lady with pockmarked skin, and let's blame her because no one actually likes her. She's dead, or she's widowed, living by herself, and then very quickly she is actually going to be dead because she's a witch. So that's a great European witch hunt, and it extends not just there, but to the colonies and the Salem witch trials and things of that sort. There's also this shift in slavery, and so this happens because the source of slaves changes. So they had slaves had traditionally been Slavic people, hence the name Slavs, from the Black Sea area, but the Ottoman Empire pushes fairly deeply into Europe in the early 1500s, pushing all the way to the gates of Vienna, and so that cuts off the trade of white slaves, because the Ottomans, who are Muslim, are taking the white Christians as slaves and not selling them to other white Christians. So that cuts off the slave trade. This means that the Europeans have to look somewhere else for slaves, and they end up looking in sub-Saharan Africa, where the slave trade had been prominent for a long time due to intertribal warfare and things like that. And so that becomes a new source of slaves in Europe, although it never really takes hold because there's so many peasants and serfs that you basically have slaves already. And so it's not really necessary. But where it does take hold is in the New World. And that's because in this colonization, there is a huge demand for sugar. Sugar is delicious. It goes well with tea, which was also kind of a hot commodity. But it also was super expensive. And so there's this huge demand for it. And to meet that demand, you need massive sugar plantations. And these massive sugar plantations need lots of workers who are used to living and working in harsh conditions, can stand up to that and not get paid, because then you lose money. And so the result is slaves. And so the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade happens, because it turns out that the Native Americans weren't the best slaves, in large part because they were all dying due to smallpox. But also, there's this weird argument that's made that they aren't used to working under those conditions. Lots of historians make it. It feels uncomfortable to me because it's kind of couched in racial terms. But you have a declining population of natives due to disease and overwork, we'll call it. And so the solution is to replace them with Africans from sub-Saharan Africa who are used to the heat and humid conditions of sub-Saharan Africa, and therefore are accustomed to that type of weather. You bring them over and you set them to work on slaves, on plantation as slaves. And so slavery suddenly becomes very much a racial thing, and it becomes hereditary. So your children are born into slavery, and that's just going to be that. And that's a real shift in the European concept of slavery. But this slavery really embeds European racial attitudes, both in Europe as of the concept of black as inferior, and also in the New World, where these Europeans bring these ideas. So that's slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, triangle trade. You should be familiar with that, and it's part of the Columbian Exchange. Looking at kind of some of the more positive changes in society at this time, is there's real major developments in arts and literature that really shape the way the world moves, especially as we move closer and closer to the Enlightenment. And one of these super important people is a Frenchman by the name of Michel de Montaigne. And he is kind of the founding father of this new school known as skepticism. And in skepticism, there's an idea that that doubt is good, and that total certainty is never attainable. And so it's this idea that we should be cautious and critical of everything, because we can never believe anything 100%. We should always be doubting ourselves if we find ourselves completely certain, because that means something went haywire and something went wrong. So that is the school of skepticism. Montaigne is also a brilliant writer, and he develops a new form of writing, and so you should all thank him for developing what's known as the essay. And his essay is a way to express new thoughts and ideas in kind of a coherent, logical manner. And so he writes proficiently. He writes so much, and he writes books of essays, and he's focusing his whole time on being open-minded, trying new ideas, understanding things from all different perspectives rather than just getting locked into his own. And Montaigne really brings about this change in thinking, where doubt and uncertainty becomes the main kind of hallmark of academic thought, at least for a while. So Montaigne is important. In literature, besides Montaigne, there's some really important writing that happens in England. Perhaps you've heard of William Shakespeare. He's writing during the time of Queen Elizabeth, the Elizabethan era. And so he's writing all his plays, all his sonnets, his Hamlets, his Romeos and Juliets, and all that good stuff. That really lasts into this day, but also sets kind of foundational ideas on modern English language, and brings a lot of new conventions in, and really elevates the writing style to an art form. So he's writing during the same era of exploration, in the 1500s. And then also at this time, the King James Bible is created. This is also known as the Authorized Bible. It's a new translation. Well, it's kind of a combination of all the older translations into a standardized new translation in English, and it becomes the standard Bible used throughout not just England, but it's used kind of throughout the English-speaking world, and is still kind of the go-to Bible that is used in Protestant churches today. The King James Version of the Bible. So there's really growth in literature, and it's kind of centered during this time in England, which is kind of a neat little thing. And then art really also shifts. We move out of the Renaissance and into a period of time known as Baroque. And Baroque comes, Baroque means like an odd-shaped pearl. And it's this idea of just being over the top, super emotional, super just kind of gaudy, right? Just over the top, too many colors, too bright, over exaggerated, so much emotion, so many exuberance expressed in these art pieces. And the whole goal is that there's an appeal to senses and to get people tied into these paintings so that they can be in awe and inspired by these paintings. And their goal as they do this is to tie it back to the power of the new Catholic Church. Well, the old Catholic Church, but the newly changed Catholic Church. You'll recall that one of the big things from the Council of Trent was that they really asked artists to focus people in on religion. They used art as a way to draw people back into religion. And so this movement, the Baroque movement, grows especially in Catholic countries because it's kind of sponsored by Catholics and pushed forward by Catholics, and becomes very popular and is very bright and extravagant and colorful, tons of gold, and it's super ornate, and it's just so much over the top. And so this is the style of the day, except in a few countries. In England, in the Netherlands, and in France, they just never really fully embraced the Baroque style. They go with more of a realist style, which is not quite as over the top. So it's a little bit different. And the name you should know from the Baroque style is Peter Paul Rubens. He's a Flemish painter, and he's probably the most influential of these Baroque artists. He's certainly the most well known. And he really just exemplifies this kind of appeal to the senses, very emotional art. And not just visual art, but music as well is classified into the Baroque time period. And this reaches its peak with a little guy by the name of Johann Sebastian Bach. And it follows in many of the same styles as the visual artistic form, the audio does. In this kind of exuberance and appeal to the senses and trying to draw people in and get them to experience something emotionally. So you have these kind of changes happening in society where there's kind of this introduction of a newish class of slaves and the beginning of racial theory. You have women's roles changing. They're being attacked for being witches. But in the midst of this, in the upper classes, you really have this joy and exuberance and excitement and over-the-top new ideas, appealing to senses of Baroque and skepticism that begin to experience and begin to be experienced in European society.